Hi, everyone. The title of this evening's sermon is Don't Blame God, Take Responsibility. It's from James chapter 1, verses 13 to 18. So my name is Nathan, and I am one of the pastors in training here at FBC. And been coming here with my wife since December. And I've lived in Phoenix for about a year now. We moved from London, where we lived when we first got married. And I've been enjoying it here so far until the last few weeks, for obvious reasons. So I'm just going to recap where we're at with the book of James. James, the author, we believe and we're fairly confident is the brother of Jesus. And at this time, he is the leader of the church in Jerusalem. The letters is the way that the early church encouraged each other, is how they addressed theological issues that they were being faced with at the time. At the time, they didn't have a long history of the church. They didn't have a super defined theology. So this is how God shared his revelation with his people in the early church. This letter of James is addressed to the Jews in diaspora. These were the first converts to Christianity, and they were Jews, of course, and they were meeting in churches, in home churches, and they were subject to persecution. They were suffering due to this and because of poverty. So suffering is not new to the Jews, and these were Christian Jews. So as you can see from the Old Testament, suffering, unfortunately, has been a long part of their history. Nonetheless, they needed to be reminded to put this suffering into perspective. This letter was written about 40 AD, which, even though it's towards the end of the Bible, is one of the first letters to be written. And it's been written before the letters of Paul. So it's one of the earliest letters. This should give us some perspective on what it says. It's one of the first teachings of the church. Looking at the specific context, in the previous verses, James talks about trials and how God uses the trials to test us, to test our faith and bring steadfastness. And it comes before the next section where James calls believers to have an active faith, not just believe the right things, but also put them into action. And it's a point of clarification. I'm just going to read the passage now. So James 1, verses 13 to 18. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desires. Then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. Do not be deceived, my beloved brothers. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. Of his own will, he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. So the message of James in these verses is, don't blame God, take responsibility. We can see that we, as humans, have been doing this from the beginning of time. If we look at Genesis 1 and 2, when Adam is faced with his sin, the first thing he does is blame God. You know, you've given me this companion that has led me astray. He didn't take responsibility, but immediately he blamed God. And you might think that this is silly, but this is something that is very natural to humans. We want to find blame so we can avoid taking responsibility. If you grew up in my household, every time the news came on, you would hear my dad say, why are they always trying to find someone to blame instead of fixing the problem? So that's just a recurring theme of humanity. But we don't want to blame God because, as the first section of this passage says, temptation does not come from God. So looking at the first verse, we see that it says, let no one that say when he is tempted. So here, I think it would help to see the flow of James' letter to understand that the word tempted here and the word test used in the previous verses in a positive way is a different form of the same word. Not to mean that it has the same meaning, but he's trying to clarify that trials and tests are good, but when it is temptation, it is bad. Tests lead us into faith, temptation leads us away from faith. So James says, let no one say when he's tempted, I am being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempt no one. We can see here that God cannot tempt because it's against his character. He is against his nature, so he just won't do it. So if you're saying that, you're basically just bearing false witness. The next verse tells us, but each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. So what James is telling us is that temptation comes from our own desire. So we might want to be tempted to blame God for our sin, for tempting us, for leading us into a situation where we are tempted and go to sin, but actually he's telling us temptation comes from our own desire. Here the word desire in Greek, if we look at the definition, it can be positive and negative. However, it has always been understood in this context to mean negative desires, fleshly desires, evil desires. And one commentator actually puts it in this way, desires that are not inspired by faith. And I think this is a very important point to understand. And then there's this metaphor, this fishing metaphor that these desires are used to lure and entice us. What does this mean? Well, Romans 6 tells us that under Christ, we're no longer slaves to sin. So Satan has no power over us. But he can use our own desires to lure us away, to pull us away. And that is his objective. So we can't blame circumstances, we can't blame God. It's with our own desires that we're being pulled away. In the next verse, James tells us that desire, when it is conceived, gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. So I want to focus on not just the fact that temptation produces death, but that there's this idea, this metaphor, like pregnancy. Speaking from personal experience, with my wife, she's pregnant now. There was a time where we were trying to conceive, and then there was a time where we were too busy, a lot of things on our plate, and we weren't particularly trying. But then, after a few weeks, my wife started feeling weird. Something was off. She thought maybe I'm sick. She considered talking to the doctor, and a few more weeks, she started feeling sick in the morning. And only weeks after conception, we did a pregnancy test and find out that she was pregnant. So there's this idea that the way this works, this temptation, the way that our desires bring us into temptation, into sin, and into death is slow, and it's not necessarily visible at the start. The pregnancy was invisible, but after a while, we started seeing effects of it. We started seeing how her body was affected by this. But it took time. And this is also echoed in Galatians 6:8, where it references as sowing either to the flesh or to the spirit. And again, if we look at this image of a little seed that goes into the ground, it's invisible. We don't see it. It's hidden in the ground. And it can stay there for a long time before anything happens, until the conditions are right. And then it can sprout. And again, not visible. We don't know what's happening. We don't know that it is happening. We don't even know that it's there. And then it grows until finally it is visible above ground. And when we see it, we might not even know what it is. It takes a while for it to mature, and then we know what it is. And then eventually it will be a plant. So there's this idea that it starts small and it can grow. And I think that's where a lot of us get stumped. We underestimate this initial desire. It can't be a big deal. It's so small. It's so small. How can this? We don't think how this will lead to death. How this will lead to sin. It's just such a tiny little thing. So I want to use the example here of an Italian connection. In Italy, you have it over here as well. Is Nutella? It's a chocolate spread. Are you not familiar with it? It's very good. You're supposed to spread this stuff. I don't think I've hardly ever done that. It's usually just a spoon. I just go for it. But a few years ago, for some reason, I thought, it'd be nice to have that. Sometimes when I want something that's nice, just take it. And it's just a spoon. I mean, what's going to happen from it? Nothing. It's a little tiny spoon. It's a lot of sugar in it, but relatively small. But then it started becoming more frequent and frequent, to the point where I go to my jar and say, someone's gone to my jar. And I've definitely yelled at my housemates for taking my Nutella. It was me. And then, so this has led to a lot of weird behaviors with anger, and I decided eventually to not use it. But this is a silly example, but it shows how something can be small. Other examples that are more serious are things like being in a situation where you have financial hardship, and you think, this thing is only $20. I know with my wife, we said we won't spend any money, but it's hot outside, and I want one of those styrofoam drinks from Circle K. How much harm can that do? It's 79 cents or whatever. Or maybe it's this coworker that has shown interest in us, and it feels good, and then it's just one text. What is that going to do? It's just a text. There's nothing harmful in it by itself. Or maybe it's just a $1 scratch card. What harm can that do? Or maybe I'm sitting in a meeting and I'm thinking, wow, this guy's really stupid. But I'm not telling it to his face. I'm not insulting him. I'm not shaming him in front of everybody. I'm not going to his boss and telling how stupid he is and ruining his career. I'm just thinking, it's just a thought. How much harm can that do? Or maybe there's a really cool crime thriller on TV. Lots of nudity. Netflix really likes to do that. And we think, but that's not what I'm interested in. I'm interested in this. And at the same time, you're letting yourself be exposed. But this is the part that we miss when it comes to sin and we're faced with it. And we want to blame God. We want to blame circumstances or anything else instead of taking responsibility. So do not blame God. Take responsibility. This leads us to the next section. Do not be deceived. James says, do not be deceived, my beloved brothers. Do not be deceived by the lie that God can tempt us. Do not be deceived by the lie that circumstances is what leads us to sin. Do not be deceived that is anything but your responsibility. Because when you do that, then you look for blame elsewhere, and you are unable to address the problem. And you might think, again, looking at Adam, we might think this is silly. Of course, when you're outside the situation, it's easy to say, oh, yeah, but it's clearly Adam's fault. He shouldn't have taken the apple. But the explicit exhortation implies the need for it. It's like when you're a little Italian boy and your mom stops putting sunscreen on you, and then you go outside and she yells, put sunscreen on. She's not yelling it because she's expecting me to put it on. She's not yelling it because it's a silly thing, it's an obvious thing, or it's something that's not going to have real consequence. In my mind, I'm thinking, if I don't have sunscreen on, I'm going to tan quicker, so I'm not going to put it on. But from experience, I can tell you, I've had a mole removed because of abnormal growth in it. Because this has taken time, 20 years for the effect to be seen. But I can blame the sun, but it's not the sun's fault. And we're all susceptible to this lie. We can all susceptible to this temptation to blame God, to blame our circumstances, and not take responsibility. So don't blame God, but take responsibility. And I like that James is not passing judgments here. He's not saying, do not be deceived, you fools. He's concerned. He's addressing his beloved brothers. It's a compassionate exhortation. So we want to heed it. Let us not be deceived. Let us not blame God for our sin. And this small verse is a transition, is a shift into the next verses. We'll see that the next verses change tone drastically. And what they do is they contrast the previous verses in a way that enhances them. And I will walk you through this. So the next verses reads, "Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights." So we learn from this that God is not giving us bad things, He's not bringing us temptation. He's bringing perfect and good gifts. This is God the Creator. Father of lights would have been familiar in Jewish language, referring to the Psalms as God as Creator. And we contrast this with verse 15. Sin brings death, God brings good thing. God brings light, God brings life. The next section of verse 17 reads, "With whom there is no variation or shadow due to change." You might be wondering why James is using this language. Why is he bringing up this character, unchanging character of God? Why is this important? Because it doesn't really fit. But it does if we look at what is contrasting. So on one side, we have God that is unchanging and steadfast and reliable. And every time we're faced with temptation, this is one of the choices we have, to be obedient to God, to be obedient to this thing that we can rely on, to this option that's safe. And on the other side, we have our desires. And these are fleeting. These are desires that you might have today and tomorrow be gone. And you think, oh yeah, I'll do that. That'll make me feel good. And then all of a sudden, it's gone and it's changed. But then there's the seed that grows, and eventually we'll be faced with it. In the National Health Services in the UK, they have this big quit smoking campaign. And one of the things that they give you in their kits is a lot of information, a lot of data about the temptation to smoke, the desire that you may be faced with. And my friend who was trying to quit smoking found that this was the single most helpful thing, is that the craving will last a few minutes, and you can put a timer on, and then you'll see that the craving will be gone. Because these desires, these human desires for gratification, they're just fleeting. If we don't address them, they'll go away. The last verse in this passage reads as follows: "Of his own will, he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits of his creatures." This is God's will for us. So he uses the first fruit language here that, again, would have been meaningful to his Jewish audience at the time. The first fruit was what was sacrificed at the temple. The first fruit is the best, is good and perfect. And this is how God is working in us. He wants us to be first fruit. He wants us to be good and perfect. Through these trials, he's shaping us in this way. And first fruits here also indicates a continuation of harvest. This is not something that just stops there, but it's supposed to usher others into the kingdom. It's continue this life of the kingdom, which opposes the theme of death from sin. But the contrast here is against the first verse that was saying, that was warning against saying that God tempts us to sin. No, this is the truth about God. God brings us salvation. This word of truth that he mentions, he brought us the word of truth. He brought us salvation. He doesn't bring us temptation to sin. He doesn't lead us to sin. He brings us to salvation. So this is the contrast. This is where the lie that we need to be aware of. It's salvation that God brings us. So let us reflect on these as we enter Passion Week, where where Jesus suffered trials for our benefit, where he endured suffering, let us look to him to kill our desires and trust in him in our trials. Though through Christ, Satan has no power over us. We've been liberated. Before we had a chain, but Christ broke that chain. We're no longer enslaved to sin. So Satan uses our own desires to try and lure us away. That is the only thing he can do. And so let us look to Christ to be strengthened in this. Let us look to Christ to find what we need. Let us obey God in the trials and not fall away. Because there's this contrast when we're facing with trials. Either we obey God and grow in our faith, or we lean on sin and our fleshly desires. So when you're faced with trials, when you're sinning, don't blame God. Take responsibility. How do we practically do this? I have 3 takeaways for you tonight to answer this question. Firstly is know that temptation originates from you, not God. It's important for us to walk right, to have right belief, to believe right things about God and about ourselves. So are you aware of this truth, or are you being deceived? God uses the trials to shape us, but it's not his fault if we fail and turn to sin. It's not his fault if we go astray. We might want to blame our circumstances. If we have an affair, we're lost in pornography. We might say, but my wife has not given me any attention for 10 years. And in this blaming the circumstances, the things that God can control, we're blaming God. But that's not true. That's a lie. That's deception. And you want to have the right understanding in order to be able to address sin. I've had diabetes, type 1 diabetes, since I was 10 years old. And I can tell you, it's been a get-out-of-jail-free card many times for me. I have justified all sorts of behaviors with it. Other people don't have to face that challenge, but I do. I go through it every day. So I've cut myself a lot of slack when I was younger, and unfortunately not too long ago either. So let us not blame the circumstances. Let us not. Did it cut off?
We might have to stop and wait a few minutes if that's okay.
Okay, yeah, no problem.
We've lost it several times.
Thank you.
I hope you can remember where you were.
There's a lot of demand, unfortunately, because everyone's home.
You can go ahead, or wherever you can restart from.
Okay. So we're having some technical difficulties, but I'll recap the last point and move forward. So it's important that we have this right belief that temptation originates in us and not with God. God does not tempt us, but it's us that tempts us. So the question for you tonight is, are you aware of this truth, or are you being deceived? Because God uses trials to shape us, and it's not his fault if we fail and turn to sin. The trials can lead us to strengthen our faith or weaken it, according to our response. And that is God's desire for us, that we become steadfast in our faith. He wants us to turn into this first fruit. But if we blame our circumstances, we're blaming God. If we're engaged in an affair or with pornography, and we say, oh, but my wife hasn't paid attention to me for the last 10 years. That's rejecting responsibility for your sin today, and it's blaming the things that God can control. So instead of growing more in reliance on Him, we're not taking responsibility and blaming Him. I've certainly done this with myself with my diabetes. I've used it to justify a lot of behaviors related to it and not so related to it. But the truth of the matter is that we are responsible for our own actions, for our own sin. God never is. And we must be aware that trials and temptations go hand in hand. When we're faced with trials, we have the choice to grow in obedience, to choose obedience and grow, but also our desires are felt more strongly. And that's where we can really learn to control them. That's where we can really learn to resist Satan so that he can flee from us. The second takeaway is recognition of sin and personal responsibility takes wisdom. If we all recognize sin, it would be easy. But to recognize our sin and our responsibility and our own action takes supernatural help from God. So wisdom is not explicitly addressed in these verses that we looked at tonight, but it is a big theme of the book of James. And in verse 5, we see James encourage us to ask God for wisdom because he's willing to give it to us. So I want to encourage you to pray and regularly ask for wisdom, for God to reveal what desires you have that are not inspired by faith. As the psalmist says, "Search me and know my heart. See if there's any wicked way in me." This is the first takeaway relates to having right belief. The second one is starting to take action, starting to show that your desire is to avoid sin and to be into God. And the third takeaway is this: take responsibility for your sin. Don't blame God. Take responsibility for your sin. What does this look like? Well, once we've prayed for wisdom and God has revealed to us, or the Holy Spirit convicts us of our sin, we want to repent to God. Turn away from a sin and repent to God. And secondly, we want to ask for forgiveness to others that we may have affected. Dr. Ball teaches in his classes that relationships have two dimensions, vertical and horizontal. So we want to make sure that we have that vertical dimension covered, but we also want to address any horizontal element, any person-to-person sin that we have. And the last point is one that I feel like is one of the most challenging in Christian life, that really requires the most sacrifice, and that we can often fall on. You know, we might be convicted of a sin and we might say, "God, I repent of this, I don't want to do it again," but then we fall back into it. This is because we missed this third step, which is making lifestyle changes. I remember years ago reading about, in Proverbs, about the adulteress and how men were just walking down the street by her house and they were enticed by her. And the writer warns to not even walk down the street. Just completely avoid this. In Italy, we have this saying where it says, "Don't put hay close to the fire." Don't put it on the fire. I mean, that's obvious, but don't put it close to the fire. Why would you risk it? Why would you put it close to the fire and it might burn out your whole house? And this is the image that I want you to have. This desire that you might follow, this temptation that you might go into, can burn down your house. It will eventually lead to death, and you might not see it today, and it might seem ridiculous, it might seem disproportionate, but that's where it's going. That's inevitable. And Jesus echoes this when he says, if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. This is what he's talking about. Take steps, take measures to avoid this, especially if you're aware that you're struggling with something, especially if you're aware something is a weakness. Definitely take active action. This is the whole rest of the book of James is about taking action, being doers. And it's hard. You don't want to change your habits. And you can go back to rationalizing how it's just a small thing. This is what happens with addicts all the time. But this is a very important point. Lastly, if you're watching tonight and you're not a believer, I have this message for you. Jesus was sent that you may know the truth, that you can be set free from temptation, from sin, and from death. There's no wisdom that can help you with this outside of Jesus, outside of our relationship with him. So I want to invite you in this relationship. I want to invite you in God's family so that you can be set free and don't have to suffer from your temptation, don't have to suffer from your sin anymore. Let me close in prayer. Father, I thank you for your revelation that you've given us, that we can learn the truth about you, the truth about life, the truth about sin and our enemy, that we can be truly free, and that you teach us how to be free. Lord, I just pray that you give us strength, give us wisdom to see where our desires can lead us astray, and to resist those desires, to resist Satan, and to be obedient to you and grow in our faith. Pray that you bless all your people as we're all spread out, and I thank you for technology that allows us to have communion together and fellowship. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.